just hit the talk button? Good morning, everyone. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on a number of ocean and fisheries-related bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at this hearing are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, and the vice chair and the vice-ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. This is our subcommittee's second legislative hearing in this Congress. It's also the second hearing with all bipartisan bills. We have done this very intentionally, as I promised we would, because we want to set a tone of teamwork and collaboration. Today we're going to again discuss bills that provide common sense, science-based solutions for issues facing our coastal communities. And despite the zero-sum partisanship that has seeped into the culture of this institution, I hope today's hearing reminds us that we really don't have to fight about everything. We can choose to just take an honest look at the facts for the sake of our constituents and coastal economies around the country and pursue the best ideas regardless of party labels. Several of these bills reauthorize highly popular and successful programs. That includes the National Sea Grant College Program, which operates in coastal and Great Lakes states as well as Guam and Puerto Rico. I introduced a bill to reauthorize and amend this broadly supported program, which unfortunately the Trump administration has targeted for elimination in its budget for fiscal year 2020. Another bill would reauthorize the Integrated Ocean Observing System, or IOOS, a federal partnership led by NOAA, whose mission is to produce and integrate high-quality ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes data to meet the nation's safety, economic, and stewardship needs. This is especially critical in the face of climate change and rising sea levels. Mr. Case's H.R. 2406, which I'm proud to co-sponsor with Mr. Young of Alaska, would reauthorize and amend the NOAA Commissioned Officers Corps Act to improve recruitment and retention of NOAA's cadre of highly specialized uniformed officers who operate NOAA's fleet of research vessels and aircraft. These reauthorizations are long overdue and much needed, as our witnesses will attest. The Digital Coast Act, introduced by Mr. Dutch Ruppersberger, would authorize NOAA to establish a digital information program to integrate coastal data with decision support tools so that our local, state, and federal partners have the best possible tools to manage our coasts in the face of flooding and sea level rise and coastal erosion. Much of this work's already being done, but we need to codify this to ensure that it's being done the right way and to provide NOAA with the resources and tools to do it efficiently. The Great Lakes Fishery Research Authorization Act, introduced by Mr. Quigley of Illinois, would authorize the USGS to provide critical scientific information to support sustainable binational fisheries management in the Great Lakes. This is a trust responsibility that the federal government must provide to tribes that hold hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on ceded land in the United States. Continuing the theme of responsible and sustainable management of our fisheries and protected species, we'll also discuss the Drift Net Modernization and Bycatch Reduction Act. California has the last remaining large-scale drift net fishery left in the United States. These nets are banned on the high seas, as other nations, including Russia, find these nets too harmful to wildlife. Drift nets do not discriminate the types of sea life they catch, resulting in tremendous bycatch and the death of thousands of animals, including whales, dolphins, sea turtles, birds, and unmarketable fish that are simply discarded. Given the amount of harmful bycatch, the state of California has banned this method of fishing and handed management of the fishery to the federal government because it has the tools to set and enforce limits on the bycatch of protected species. NOAA Fisheries proposed rulemaking to do just that, but the Trump administration withdrew the rule against California's wishes. There are far safer, more economic ways to catch swordfish than this, and it's time to modernize this fishery. This bill would phase out large-scale drift nets and help fishermen adopt alternative practices to minimize bycatch. And the Senate companion bill has already been reported favorably by the Senate Commerce Committee. Like many of the other bills we're considering, the Drift Net Modernization and Bycatch Reduction Act was also reported favorably by the Senate Commerce Committee last Congress. Moving on, Mr. Young introduced the Young Fishermen's Development Act. This bill would encourage young people's participation in commercial fishing, as well as provide technical training for new and emerging fishing technologies so we can ensure that our fisheries and working waterfronts will thrive for generations to come. Mr. Young also introduced the American Fisheries Advisory Committee Act, which establishes a committee to assist in the awarding of fisheries research and development grants, giving voices to recreation and commercial fishing communities when directing the future of fisheries research. Finally, H.R. 417, introduced by Mr. Soto of Florida, would ban the importation or interstate sale of lionfish, which are an invasive species originally from the South Pacific and Indian Oceans, brought to the U.S. in the aquarium trade. They are devastating our tropical Atlantic reef ecosystem. So these are all good bills we're considering today, not just because they have bipartisan support, but because they'll produce broad benefits that are especially important for coastal communities in the Great Lakes region. With that, I will recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes, but first let me just ask unanimous consent that the gentleperson from Alaska, Representative Young, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's proceedings. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Mr. McClintock is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee meets today to consider 9 bills dealing with various aspects of ocean resource management. H.R. 417 by Mr. Soto establishes measures to control the epidemic of invasive lionfish in the Gulf of Mexico and South Atlantic. The invasive nature of the lionfish and the damage it's done to the habitats into which it's been introduced is well documented, although the question arises if this legislation isn't closing the barn door after the wolves have entered. H.R. 1218 by Mr. Young reestablishes an advisory committee of stakeholders to help direct federal grants to areas and initiatives that are best suited to promote the American seafood industry, funded by duties on seafood imported into the United States. While we need to exercise caution whenever creating advisory groups, this legislation should get Washington, D.C. out of the way and allow for more effective program directed by the people that know best. H.R. 1314, also by Mr. Young, reauthorizes the Integrated Ocean Observation System. This system provides data to coastal communities and local fishermen on weather and ocean conditions. The system is critical to early detection of hurricanes and other natural disasters. Unfortunately, this legislation maintains an open, limitless authorization of funds for this program and should be amended to specific appropriation limits, as Senate versions of the measure have done. H.R. 1023 by Mr. Quigley creates a new federal fishery monitoring program in the Great Lakes Basin. It begs the question of why it doesn't employ either the National Marine Fisheries Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to conduct these fishery studies. Instead, it tasks an agency that has little experience in fisheries science and management, the U.S. Geological Survey. This is especially baffling as NOAA already receives $28 million for ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes research and another $2.9 million for interjurisdictional fishery grants, which can be used for Great Lakes management and science. H.R. 1240, also by Mr. Young, establishes a federal grant program to support education, training, and mentoring of young fishermen. It raises 2 concerns I hope will be addressed. First, what is to assure these funds go to promote the young fishermen that they are meant for and not to third-party groups and NGOs that often try to put fishermen out of business? And second, is it wise to predicate funding for any program on the NOAA's asset forfeiture program, which sets up perverse incentives for that agency to seize private property without due process of law? H.R. 1979 by Mr. Liu adopts a blanket prohibition against the use of drift nets in federal waters. It bypasses the existing council process that we heard just last week works so well. As we learned at that hearing, American fishery populations are already carefully monitored and regulated, and if anything, are currently underutilized. As we hear today, this legislation does nothing to improve fisheries management, but instead does great harm in 2 respects. It takes away the earnings of American fishermen and raises the price of seafood for every American family. H.R. 2189 by Mr. Rupensberger authorizes $4 million annually for an already existing federal program that's been operating successfully within existing funds since 2007. H.R. 2405 by Chairman Huffman reauthorizes NOAA's Sea Grant program by more than $10 million than the currently appropriated levels and increases that authorization by nearly 5% annually after that. This program is one that the President rightfully sought to eliminate in his budget to free up funding for NOAA to complete its core functions. And finally, H.R. 2406 by Mr. Case would dramatically expand NOAA's commissioned officer corps. This is a pretend Navy given temporary uniform status during World War II. A long list of government reform initiatives, including Al Gore's Reinventing Government initiative in 1996, have sought to eliminate it, but to no avail. As a result, we now have a program with a growing retirement fund crisis, a culture of sexual harassment and inappropriate personnel management, 70 years of mission creep, and growing allegations of financial mismanagement, inability to account for costs and other issues. Mr. Chairman, the prime function of these authorizing committees like ours is to conduct oversight over the federal agencies and programs under our jurisdictions. Fortunately, or I should say unfortunately, most of the bills in front of us today create new programs without justification or rubber stamp programs rampant with problems. We owe it to the American public to do better. I yield back.
All right, thank you. The chair is now going to recognize Mr. Case for 5 minutes. He's got a tight schedule and has to leave early, but since we're discussing a bill that he is sponsoring, I'd like to welcome him to give some remarks. Mr. Case of Hawaii, of course, is the lead sponsor of H.R. 2406. The floor is yours, Mr. Case, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for facilitating my schedule. Thank you for holding this hearing today, for including H.R. 2406, the Noaa Corps Amendments Act of 2019, on the agenda, and for co-sponsoring this bill. I would also like to thank Admiral Gallaudet for appearing before the subcommittee to testify about this and the other bills we are hearing today. I appreciate NOAA's feedback and technical assistance as the bill was drafted and look forward to continuing to work together. Last year, with Chair Huffman and Congressman Young of Alaska, I introduced 2406, which would reauthorize the Noaa Corps, which has not been done since Congressman Young passed the last authorization in 2002. And it is time that we pass a reauthorization to support the Noaa Corps, as they have continuously supported the nation through their important work. The women and men of the Noaa Corps operate NOAA's highly specialized fleet of research and survey ships and aircraft, including the famous hurricane hunters aviators, which fly into, above, and around hurricanes to give the Weather Service forecasters accurate data for their storm forecasts and warnings, which are used by emergency managers as they make life and death decisions. Several of the ships in NOAA's fleet are based in my state of Hawaii and conduct surveys used to research and manage our Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument and our fisheries and protected species, as well as study and map the ocean floor throughout the entire Pacific Ocean, a critical area for our country. These are vital services not only for our state, but for our country also, to understand the ocean surrounding us. Noaa Corps officers all have technical backgrounds in the relevant mission subject areas such as fisheries, meteorology, hydrography, and engineering. While chartering and contracting work is sometimes necessary for their missions, and NOAA has the ability to do so as needed, the expertise and experience of the permanent Corps cannot be replaced. But we need not only to reauthorize the Corps, but to improve it and to respect it as an integrated part of our uniformed services. Like the other uniformed services, Noaa Corps officers spend most of their careers away from home at sea, in the air, and in remote locations such as Antarctica, conducting this important work. However, the Corps is often overlooked in the legislative process, resulting in a patchwork of statutory authorities, benefits, and obligations of services. It is simply not treated as a fair and equal basis, on a fair and equal basis as the other uniformed services. This bill will help the Noaa Corps improve recruitment, retention, and diversity to attract the best and the brightest commissioned officers and better align the Noaa Corps with the other uniformed services as they continue their great service to NOAA and the nation. While the Noaa Corps may be small, they serve this country with distinction, and we owe it to these service members to provide them with the same basic support and benefits to which the other uniformed services are entitled. This bill gives NOAA the ability to determine the size of the Corps up to 500 officers, subject to Congress's appropriating power. This is necessary to allow the agency to react to emerging needs and would provide greater flexibility in assigning officers to different billets. It is also fully consistent with our commitment to recapitalize the entire NOAA fleet over the coming decades. Noaa Corps officers are in high demand throughout the agency, and often the Corps has to balance competing needs in NOAA's programs and its operational fleet. Providing flexibility to increase the size of the Corps, subject to Congress's appropriating power, will help to ensure that the fleet is safely staffed and the NOAA programs can take advantage of the Corps' technical expertise and experience. This bill is an important step to make sure that the Noaa Corps has the authorities it needs to be an effective service for our country. I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass this bill and to supporting the women and men of the Noaa Corps. And now to some of the comments made as to the bill in the testimony and by the ranking member. First of all, I think that anybody that has ever spent time on a NOAA ship, as I have, the Hi'i'alakai, for 6 days some years ago, will realize that this is no quote-unquote pretend Navy. I frankly think that that is just, I will pass on the comment and assume that it is born out of misunderstanding of what the Corps actually does. When you spend time with NOAA, either on their ships or in their airplanes, you realize that they perform the same basic services as any other service, and that's why they are a uniformed service. As to the comment in some of the testimony that we should somehow privatize NOAA altogether, I completely disagree with that. I think we might as well say that we should privatize the Coast Guard. Again, I think a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of NOAA within our uniformed services. As to the comment on mission creep, I would suggest respectfully that there are very few missions out there that are as important as our oceans and our air in our current world. We have now spent weeks and months talking about climate change, man-induced climate change, and how to measure it, quantify it, create good science around it, and then act on that. And NOAA is an integral part of that entire effort. And so if the argument is that the NOAA services are somehow trying to take care of the problems that face us, I'm all with that argument. I think we've got to be sure that this Corps completely fulfills an expanded mission as we go into the next critical generations on climate change. I look forward to discussing the rest of the objections raised to this bill. I appreciate the dialogue. I think it will be instructive to all of us as we understand this incredibly important agency.
Thank you, Mr. Case.
And improve on it. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the Dean of the House, Mr. Young. I'll note that we may not have a Kentucky Derby, or we may not have a Triple Crown winner this year, but Mr. Young has 3 bills in today's hearing.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm a little bit shocked. You want to know the truth? This bipartisan stuff can go a long ways around here. But anyway, I thank you for holding a hearing on these bills. I have 3 of them, and 2 of the bills I support as original co-sponsor. The first bill, of course, is H.R. 1218, the American Fisheries Advisory Committee Act. Second bill is H.R. 1240, the Young Fishermen's Development Act. And, of course, the third one is H.R. 1314, the Integrated Coastal and Ocean Observation System Act. And, Mr. Chairman, I compliment you and the members of this committee. Oceans are one of our most important resources that we have, and I think we've neglected them. We have to make sure, though, as we try to address that neglect, that we don't do harm to individuals who are involved in trying to harvest the appropriate amount of fish from the areas. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair will now welcome our administration witness from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, whose agency touches all but one of the bills we'll be hearing about today. It's my pleasure to introduce Rear Admiral Timothy Gallaudet, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and Deputy NOAA Administrator, where he oversees the wet side of NOAA's programs and policies, including oceans, coasts, and fisheries. Admiral Gallaudet previously served the nation for 32 years in the U.S. Navy, most recently as Oceanographer of the Navy. He holds a doctoral degree from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Mr. Admiral Gallaudet, welcome. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member McClintock and members of the subcommittee for this great opportunity to testify today regarding several ocean bills. The Department of Commerce and NOAA greatly appreciate the subcommittee's support for ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes issues. We look forward to our continued collaboration together. NOAA data and services are critical to ensuring public safety, efficient resource utilization and conservation, and hazard mitigation. And for this reason, we support the Integrated Coastal and Ocean Observing System Act amendments of 2019 and the Digital Coast Act. Both pieces of legislation support programs that are fundamental in providing data through networks to meet the nation's needs. Through community outreach and partner-based services, the data that these programs produce are used by decision makers to address changing environmental conditions and drive economic growth. The data we collected and shared were vital to the life-saving work of NOAA and our partners during the hurricane seasons of 2017 and 2018 and have contributed to a growing, vibrant American blue economy. NOAA and the department strongly support sustainable and profitable American fisheries. We are actively working to increase opportunity and improve access for young entry-level fishermen through community-based development quota shares, the Alaska Young Fishermen's Education Program, and other apprenticeship programs, while strengthening the competitiveness of all forms of our nation's seafood production. However, we believe the Young Fishermen Development Act and the American Fisheries Advisory Committee Act direct actions that are already being conducted effectively by NOAA and other organizations under previously enacted legislation. And there are also factors that make implementation of those bills challenging. While we appreciate discussions to date with the sponsors of the DriftNet Modernization Act, we are concerned that the legislation does not adequately consider the current status of protected species bycatch in this fishery, which are now low given the previously adopted stringent measures. Furthermore, NOAA believes it is most appropriate for this issue to continue to work its way through the council process established by the Magnuson-Stevens Act. The Pacific Fisheries Management Council will review alternative gears and protected species bycatch reduction measures this fall. NOAA remains an active partner with the council in ensuring a vibrant and sustainable U.S. swordfish fishery. And for instance, just this week, we authorized additional testing of new gear to further reduce bycatch. Last and certainly not least is the Noaa Corps Reauthorization Bill. While the department has not completed its review due to its recent submission, I'll make a few observations about the Noaa Corps with my perspective of having served 32 years in another uniformed service, the U.S. Navy. And simply put, I have not seen a more versatile, intelligent, and dedicated group in all of government. These brave officers, they are not an armed service, they are armed only with superior intellect and cutting-edge technology, flying through hurricanes, performing low-level aerial environmental reconnaissance missions, commanding ships that sail all over the globe, and performing extremely technical scuba diving that is equivalent in a risk to high-altitude mountain climbing. They assist in operating our global satellite and environmental data collection systems, producing life-saving weather forecasts and warnings, mapping, charting, and exploring our exclusive economic zones, managing our nation's fisheries, and conserving, protecting, and restoring natural resources. And they have repeatedly demonstrated a surge capacity, most recently during the government shutdown, where they performed a myriad of functions to keep NOAA operating. And more notably, after the hurricanes of this last year, they conducted critical port clearance surveys, aerial imaging of storm damage and flooding, as well as cleaning up hazardous materials with our Coast Guard partners. None of these activities could have been conducted by a contract service given the urgent time required. A significant and important provision in this legislation recognizes the service provided by the Noaa Corps officers and will allow current and former Noaa Corps officers to apply for jobs being filled under merit status procedures. The ability to retain the talent, dedication, and experience of Noaa Corps officers within the federal workforce will benefit all. So in conclusion, NOAA looks forward to continued support from the subcommittee as NOAA leads the world in ocean science, serving the nation's ocean-dependent communities, and ensuring responsible stewardship of our natural resources. Thank you for your leadership, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes, and I'd like to begin by asking you about the Sea Grant program. In numerous venues, you and other members of NOAA leadership team have talked extensively about the blue economy, and so I want to ask what role you see for Sea Grant in this area, and how does NOAA intend to make use of Sea Grant's extensive network of partners and stakeholders?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. The Sea Grant program is yielding great benefits for our blue economy this year. We have activities going on in all coastal states and the Great Lakes states through Sea Grant to support fishing, tourism and recreation, and safety of our fisheries. So we think the program has performed well. We did not fund it in FY20, but due to the prioritization of other core services at NOAA and in the administration, other activities such as national and homeland defense.
All right. Regarding Noaa Corps, you heard the ranking member's opening statement, some fairly withering criticisms of this program, calling it a pretend Navy, describing it in ways that sounded more like a bad frat house than a legitimate public program. You've been in the Navy for 32 years. You're now in a position to understand this program very well. Could you speak to the value that NOAA's Commissioned Officer Corps provides to the nation, and whether you agree with those characterizations?
Thanks, Congressman. Yes, sir. The Noaa Corps, as I said in my statement, is performing at a level that I think equals or even exceeds other uniformed services, and I know this from my Navy experience. And as Congressman Case mentioned, the value they provide for keeping our country safe with observational data that feeds our weather models, as well as supporting our blue economy through fisheries, through support to coastal economies, as well as charting our nation's waterways and seaports that allow $5.4 trillion of economic activity to occur every year, is a direct result of the performance and professionalism of the Noaa Corps. I do not agree with the characterizations that they're a pretend Navy, and I think they're a vital member of our uniformed services.
Thank you, Admiral. Regarding drift gill nets, I believe I heard you say that your position, or the administration's position, is to let the Pacific Council handle this matter. Is that right?
Yes, Chairman.
So I'm a little confused by that, and I want to just ask you very specifically about that, because NIMS previously approved a unanimous recommendation by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council in 2015 to implement what are referred to as hard caps, limits on the number of protected species, such as dolphins and sea turtles, that could be caught each year by the drift gill net fishery. And this rule would have triggered automatic closure if that limit was met. This administration then reversed that rulemaking, and here we stand. So I'm a little confused by the position of letting the council resolve this, because when the council took action to protect ocean resources, this administration overruled them. Can you explain that, what seems like a disconnect there?
Yes, Chairman. The decision-making behind this was based on the data. And if you look at the last 26 years of bycatch data, we noticed that there's been an extreme decline. In fact, in 1990, for example, I believe we had 21 loggerhead turtles, leatherback, pardon me, bycatch, and about 224 porpoises. And in 2015, the number was for loggerheads 2, and for, or leatherbacks, pardon me, and for porpoises 8. So we believe there was not a need to impose caps, because the bycatch rates are very low, and it's due to the measures we've adopted through the council previously.
Well understood, but I'm still confused by the statement that you want to let the Pacific Council decide this, except when the council decides to take protective measures against bycatch, and then you don't want them to decide it because you disagree with their analysis of the data. Is that right?
Chairman, that was in 2015, you said, and I really don't, I wasn't here, and the administration was not overseeing NOAA.
Could I get your commitment that if the Pacific Council takes protective action by way of a new rulemaking, that you would not overrule them again?
Yes, sir. Okay,
very good. Thank you. The chair yields back and recognizes Mr. Young. Are you next?
Yeah, I'm next.
For 5 minutes.
Admiral, when did you join the Navy?
1985, Congressman.
And how old were you?
52.
No, how old were you?
18.
18. Well, congratulations. You held up well. I'm proud of you. And thank you for your service. I'm just interested in the one bill that I have here. I believe it's the NOAA bill on SK grant program. I have had complaints, and like you say, you're relatively new, about it being used as a slush fund. And I hear that from fishermen. And NOAA is, in fact, using SK funds to fund offshore aquaculture, which, you know, I do not support, especially in Alaska. And I'm just asking you, for me, would you provide the committee the list of the last 10 years of all SK grants awarded and grants that were denied to commercial fishermen? You'd have to go back and do it. You can't do it right now.
Yes, Congressman, we will provide it to you.
Yeah. And I do compliment you on the drift net. I do have some problems with that proposal, because it probably affects my state more than anything else, because we do use a drift net in the bay, Bristol Bay, for our big fisheries. That's how they catch the fish. There's very little bycatch, by the way, and we'd have some in southeast and hardly any bycatch. So we have to be a little careful. That is run by the North Pacific Fisheries Council, and I think they've done a good job, and as long as you listen to them, we'll be in good shape. I don't have any other questions of the Admiral, sir.
Very good. Well, Admiral Gallaudet, Mr. Whitman, did you have questions? Oh, very good. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
All right. Admiral, thanks again. Thanks for your service to our nation in the Navy and today in your current role. I wanted to just mention the National Sea Grant Program. And in Virginia, it's an extraordinarily important program, both in what it provides in the research side, the engineering side, the education side. The program in Virginia is jointly implemented by a number of different universities. The lead university is Virginia Institute of Marine Science, which does an extraordinary job in taking the research that goes on there and applying it very, very specifically to elements of the seafood industry. In fact, today as we speak, Virginia is #1 in clam aquaculture and in oyster aquaculture, and that's a direct result from the research that's done by the institution there in conjunction with folks in the seafood industries, particularly in the aquaculture industry. So it's been a real boom, not only for the economy there, but as we know, there's a secondary positive effect with critters like clams and oysters that are great filter feeders as we deal with algae populations and nutrients in the Chesapeake Bay. So they've all been extraordinarily important. So I just wanted to get your perspective. How have you seen the Sea Grant program grow, not only historically through the 50 years, but in your tenure there? And how do you see the program contributing in the future? What are the things that the program can do to do even more to help in the elements of practical research, data, and concepts being applied to where it has utility to coastal communities and even to inland states? A lot of people don't associate Sea Grant with inland states, but there is a positive impact there. So just kind of give me your perspective, both historically, but then what do you see as the future for Sea Grant?
Thanks, Congressman. I appreciate your question. The Sea Grant program, as I mentioned, is doing great work across the country, and the aquaculture you mentioned in partnership with VIMS is an area that NOAA has focused on under this administration. In fact, the Secretary has committed to reducing the nation's seafood deficit, and we will do that by growing a domestic aquaculture industry. And so we're taking great action to do that, including trying to streamline permitting as well as advancing aquaculture research. So Sea Grant has contributed to that, but NOAA has other efforts within NOAA Fisheries, within the National Ocean Service, and to advance aquaculture, the science, as well as supporting business development in areas like Virginia. So, you know, as again I said, we were forced to make some tough decisions during the FY20 budget, and we elected to prioritize lower grants to states, knowing that they would still pursue some of those activities, albeit with less federal funding. So, for example, both in your state and elsewhere, I know that many of the Sea Grant activities will continue and under state funding, and the country will benefit because of it.
Very good. Do you see a role for the Sea Grant program not only in the applied research area as we see with aquaculture, but also in helping with state efforts in gathering data on fisheries and how that's integrated with national efforts, the regional commissions and councils that manage fisheries to make sure there's a look at sustainability? I think there's all some interconnectivity there. A lot of times we associate Sea Grant with just the application side, but I think many times too what we can look at is what are the things that we can do, because there's a connection between wild catch, aquaculture, and how do we manage the entire resource, not only that's intensely managed, but that's naturally occurring.
Yes, Congressman, I think you're absolutely right. There's a data collection element of the Sea Grant programs that are important for sustainable fisheries management and development. In fact, an aspect related to that is the Sea Grant Fellow Program, because many of our fellows, they come from universities and institutions like VIMS, with advanced degrees, masters, and doctorates, so they have practical experience doing this kind of data collection and analysis, and now they're working across the federal government and within NOAA. These John Knauss Fellows have really performed superbly for our nation, And in fact, there is a provision in this bill that would allow for direct hiring of those people, which we would greatly support.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. I know a great example at VIMS is not only folks that have been through the Sea Grant program there, having received their degrees, and then working in certain elements of government, but what we also see, too, is a number of those individuals that are actually opening up their own businesses that know the science, are great centers for data collection to be able to put that back in as far as how the resources are managed. So I appreciate you pointing that out. And again, you know, VIMS has been very, very forward-looking in how they create the atmosphere for those individuals to learn, to understand that once they move on from the Sea Grant program or their degree programs at VIMS, wherever they land, if they're working within that realm, for them to be resources for us to make sure we get as much data as we can. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Mr. Gallaudet, that concludes our questions. We will thank and excuse you. Appreciate very much your testimony today. And while the next panel is coming forward, I'm going to ask Mr. Young if he will grant unanimous consent to have opening statements by Representatives Liu and Fitzpatrick, as well as Representative Soto, entered into the record. I see no objection because Mr. Young is not paying attention, but that means...
I couldn't object to the chairman.
Yep, so those will be entered in the record, and we will invite our second panel to come forward. While they're doing that, I'll go ahead and introduce them in the order that we'll be hearing from them. Our first witness will be Dr. Seth Moore, Director of Biology and Environment for the Grand Portage Band of Chippewa. He joins us today from Minnesota. He'll be testifying on the Great Lakes Fishery Research Authorization Act of 2019. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Molly McCammon. She's the Executive Director of the Alaska Ocean Observing System. She'll be testifying on the Integrated Coastal Ocean Observing System Act Amendments of 2019 and the National Sea Grant College Program Amendments of 2019. And then we will have Mr. Bill Shedd, President of the American Fishing Tackle Company, testifying also on behalf of the American Sport Fishing Association, the Coastal Conservation Association, and the International Game Fish Association. Following him will be Mr. Gary Burke, a fisherman and a member of the Board of Directors of the Commercial Fishermen of Santa Barbara. And next will be Ms. Sarah Newkirk, Director of Disaster Resilience of the Nature Conservancy. She'll be testifying on the Digital Coast Act. Following her will be my old Sea Grant fellow, Dr. Zach Penny. Welcome, Zach. Good to have you back. He's the Fishery Science Department Manager for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and Dr. Penny will be testifying about the National Sea Grant College Program Amendments Act. Could not be more proud to have Zach back in the committee. Finally, we'll be hearing from Mr. Steve Ellis, Vice President of Taxpayers for Common Sense. So let me remind all the witnesses that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. The entire statement, written statement, will appear in the hearing record. Just so you know what to expect when you begin, there'll be a green light. 4 minutes in, it will turn yellow. When the light turns red, we will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we bring it back to the members for questions. So with that, we will begin by recognizing Dr. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chair Huffman, thank you for inviting me to appear before this committee to discuss the Great Lakes Fishery Research Authorization Act, H.R. 1023, that was introduced by Mike Quigley and Fred Upton. My name is Seth Moore. I'm the Director of Biology and Environment for the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. I'm here first and foremost on behalf of the Grand Portage Band, who signed two treaties in 1842 and 1854 with your predecessors. I'm here on behalf of the 33 tribes in the Midwest who also signed treaties ceding vast pieces of land to the continental United States. I'm here on behalf of the Council of Lake Committees, which is a council comprised of all the management jurisdictions within the Great Lakes from both Canadian and United States entities. And I'm here on behalf of the Lake Superior Committee, a committee of the same management agencies strictly for Lake Superior, and I'm the current chairman of that committee. But I'm going to center my comments today around the fact that I'm serving the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa with regards to this Fishery Research Authorization Act. And the Great Lakes fishery generates about $3 billion in economic revenue for the continental United States and is comprised of more than 50,000 jobs related to fisheries issues. But in regards to the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, who signed treaties in 1842 and in 1854, those Chippewa tribes expressly reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather within the Great Lakes watershed and within the ceded lands that are indicated in this image. 45% of the Great Lakes Basin is lands and waters that have been ceded by the Midwestern Chippewa tribes with those rights to hunt, fish, and gather. Those rights indicate that the species that are hunted, fished, and gathered need to be present and need to be edible and consumable. So when folks like Congress or the current administration reduces environmental protections so that those consumable species are no longer consumable because they're toxic or are no longer present, then those rights have thus been violated. So my argument here in regards to this fisheries authorization bill is the United States federal government has a trust responsibility to the tribes whom have ceded these large pieces of land and waters to the federal government to sustain those resources that were protected for hunting, fishing, and gathering to those tribes. Thus, my argument here is there is a federal trust responsibility to conduct science on natural resources and environmental issues as part of that responsibility to uphold sustainable fisheries, sustainable environment for tribal people. The treaty reserves rights require those sustainable populations of subsistent species are present and in quantities that allow for exercise of those rights. The tribal management of the Great Lakes and its watershed occurs over more than 45% of the Great Lakes Basin. The commercial and subsistence fisheries require effective research and management to enable the sustainable stocks into perpetuity, and the Department of Interior has a science arm, which is the U.S. Geological Survey, that owns that trust responsibility to tribes to conduct research on the Great Lakes. The goal here is to develop United States Geological Survey policy to enable authorization and funding for research on Great Lakes and to help to support the collaboration and consultation with the federally recognized tribes to deliver on that trust responsibility. There was some scathing commentary before this session began, begging the question why this research responsibility didn't fall to NOAA and didn't fall to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In 1970, President Nixon passed an act forming the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration and giving jurisdiction to NOAA on the coasts. However, that jurisdiction was not granted in the Great Lakes. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service historically took on the responsibility of fisheries research and management without appropriate authorization. That was then passed to U.S. Geological Survey when the Biological Resources Division was formed. They have 50 years' experience doing this. They simply do not have the authorization and funding to do so. I'll reiterate there is a federal trust responsibility to conduct science on natural resources and environmental issues, and I'll reiterate by saying U.S. Geological Survey's Deepwater Science Program is the correct vehicle with which to do that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Moore. We'll next hear from Ms. McCammon. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing. The Alaska Ocean Observing System, or AOOS, is the Alaska regional component of the National Integrated Ocean Observing System, or IOOS. We enjoy a close partnership and numerous collaborations with Alaska Sea Grant. Our nation, as you know, faces tremendous challenges and opportunities in the coming years because of the changes we now see in our oceans and on our coasts, affecting millions of people and billions of dollars of infrastructure across the U.S. We have coastal flooding and erosion, warming ocean temperatures with consequent harmful algal blooms and changing fish populations, ocean acidification, less sea ice in the Arctic, increases in tourism and shipping. To better respond to these changes, we need better and more integrated data and information. The U.S. IOOS is an innovative partnership, 20 years old now, that does that through a system of collecting the 18 federal agencies and a network of 11 regional coastal observing systems. The National Sea Grant College Program, in existence for 50 years as a joint federal and state program, provides support and solutions for coastal communities, economies, and environmental quality. Before IUS existed, ocean and coastal observations were dispersed, not easily accessed, and funded primarily through short-term research grants. All 11 IUS regional associations now operate regional data centers that serve data, visualization tools, and information products tailored to the decision-making needs of local users. All 11 are now certified as meeting rigorous federal standards for data management and quality. The interagency federal partnership is also critical and relies on having a strong program office in NOAA. Both IUS and Sea Grant are unique NOAA programs addressing national issues that manifest at the regional, state, and local levels. Through partnerships and by leveraging state and private funds, the two programs together are greater than the sum of their parts in terms of their impact and usefulness to the coastal and Great Lakes communities that we serve. So every day, people rely on IUS data and information products and Sea Grant research and extension agent support, and I want to give you just a few examples. IUS supports regional coastal acidification networks that work with shellfish hatcheries and farmers to mitigate the intake of acidic waters at these sites. Local Sea Grants are strong partners in these networks. Sea Grant and IUS regions are taking the lead in responding locally to the increasing threats from harmful algal blooms. We're even seeing them in the Arctic now by establishing warnings and alerts for beachgoers, shellfish farmers, and subsistence clam harvesters. Alaska Sea Grant trains young fishermen on the business of fishing with tools, with marketing, and business advice. AUS and the other IUS regions provide ocean data to the managers of those fisheries. IUS data from moorings and gliders monitoring sea temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico are now used to forecast hurricane intensity with greater accuracy. Local Sea Grants work closely with coastal communities to make them more resilient to increased storm effects. AUS is now piloting some new water level observing technologies and data products to better forecast storm surge and flooding, especially in western Alaska, which no longer has sea ice to act as a buffer during those fall and winter storms. Tourism businesses use IUS forecasts and real-time data to plan safe boat excursions and to minimize harm to beachgoers from riptides and poor water quality. The U.S. Coast Guard uses the real-time surface current information from land-based radars to decrease the size of their search area, thereby increasing the success of potential rescues and improving emergency response. Thanks to IUS, the Bering Strait region will soon have new radars as ship traffic increases in that region. For the last 3 years, the administration has proposed to eliminate funding for the Sea Grant program and to drastically cut funding for IUS. Yet each year, Congress has restored the funding because we deliver vital ocean and coastal data and information, create jobs, and improve safety, environmental quality, and the blue economy. We are making a difference to the people who live and work on our oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes on a daily basis. Passing these bills with strong authorization levels will signify the importance of the programs and ensure their stability for the next 5 years. Thank you for letting me speak today.
Thank you, Ms. McCammon. The chair now recognizes Mr. Shedd for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman. My name is Bill Shedd. I'm president of the American Fishing Tackle Manufacturing Company and an avid recreational angler. Conservation is woven into my business model and is the foundation of my life's work. I'm here today to testify on behalf of H.R. 1979, the Drift Net Modernization and Bycatch Reduction Act. There has been decades of effort trying to clean up the California sword fishery, yet it remains one of the most indiscriminate fisheries in the country. Passage of H.R. 1979 will greatly reduce unnecessary bycatch, help produce higher quality seafood, and even increase the number of commercial fishing jobs in the California swordfish fishery. California is the last remaining state allowing the use of this indiscriminate fishing gear. But just last year, the California legislature passed a bill to phase out drift gill nets by a combined vote of 119-1. The California swordfish fishery is jointly managed at both the state and federal level, so it's critical that Congress act to close the loop on this fishery. H.R. 1979's most immediate value is to bring federal law and California state law into alignment. As I previously mentioned, the most important reason to eliminate the use of this gear is to prevent its long-known problem of unwanted bycatch. Despite years of attempts to regulate the indiscriminate nature of the California drift gill nets, the decadal estimate of finfish bycatch from 2004 to 2014 is 64%. Bycatch includes marine mammals, turtles, whales, important sport fish, such as striped marlin, bluefin tuna, and sharks, at least 20% of which are released dead. For decades, drift gillnet fishermen have asserted that the gear does not cause significant damage to the marine resource. However, the facts do not support that position, as there is much data available regarding drift gillnet bycatch. I have personal knowledge on this subject from spending a lifetime on the ocean and around others with direct knowledge. I've personally been approached by a driftnet gillnet fisherman who developed a conscience about marine resource damage caused using this gear over a number of years. Several years ago, on the condition of maintaining this person's anonymity, the boat captain provided me with a video he took on his boat that showed dead bycatch of marlin, a whale, dolphin, turtles, sharks, and more. Similar images are widely available on the internet, and they continue to disturb me to this day. The time to end this destructive fishing practice is long overdue. Just as sport fishing jobs are important, so are commercial fishing jobs. However, the use of drift gill nets employs very few people. In 2017, there were less than 20 boats using drift gill nets in the commercial swordfish fishery. With the elimination of drift gill nets in California, more commercial fishing jobs will be gained than will be lost. Yes, you heard that right. More commercial fishing jobs will be gained than lost. According to a recent analysis done by the Pacific Fishery Management Council's Highly Migratory Species Management Team, deep-set buoy gear has the potential to land far more swordfish than has recently been landed by the drift gill net fleet. Development of this new gear over the last 6 years has proven itself to be successful. In addition to creating more commercial jobs and being far friendlier to the marine environment, deep-set buoy gear is more profitable to the commercial fishermen. That is because it produces a far fresher product and can receive a market price nearly double of that from drift gill net caught fish. According to Noaa Fisheries, in 2017, 5 vessels fishing deep-set buoy gear landed a fish value of $874,000, or $81,724 per vessel, while 17 drift gill net vessels landed fish valued at $890,442, or $52,379 per vessel. In addition, boats using deep-set buoy gear can also harpoon swordfish at the same time, making their operation even more profitable. My father fished commercially for swordfish by harpoon for over 20 years in California. I also fished commercially on his boat. As someone who has experienced this fishery both commercially and recreationally, I feel strongly that there is room for both parties to sustain profitability if conservation and common sense management measures are adopted. On a final note, I had an opportunity to review Noaa's testimony and was disappointed to see the agency's claim that transitioning from drift gill nets to deep-set buoy gear would make the fishery economically unviable, as that is simply not the case. The Pacific Council has reviewed the performance of deep-set buoy gear and determined that just 50 boats, and there's already 50 permits that have been applied for, would produce 250 metric tons of swordfish.
Mr. Shedd, I'm going to come back to you on this question to give you a little more time to expand on this point, because it was something I was going to ask you about. But since your time has expired, I'm going to ask you to hold there if you would, please. And
yes, sir.
And
be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
So we'll be back on this subject, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Burke for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Congressman Young, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and provide perspective of the commercial fishermen on H.R. 1979. My name is Gary Burke. I'm appearing today on behalf of the Ventura County Commercial Fishermen's Association. I've been born and raised in California and resided in Santa Barbara since 1964, and I've been a commercial fisherman since 1972, and I've fished in the DGN fishery since it started 40 years ago. Fishing for swordfish with drift gill nets allows me to catch swordfish and other valuable species. I'm also a member of the Pacific Council Highly Migratory Subspecies Advisory Panel. I'm here to express strong concerns about H.R. 1979, which would eliminate responsible, managed, sustainable U.S. fisheries and have the following negative impacts. It would end livelihoods, disrupt families, eliminate jobs, and hurt U.S. coastal economies. It would deprive U.S. seafood consumers of responsibly harvest sustainable seafood, increase foreign imports from far less responsible fisheries. This bill is drafted in a way that it makes it seem like it would be easy transition to cleaner gear, and the fishermen would not suffer economically. The truth is, this other gear is not ready for prime time and would bankrupt most drift net fishermen if they're forced to depend on it to catch swordfish. Someone once said the mind is like a parachute. It only works if it's opened. I have a feeling a lot of you have already decided on this bill, but I hope not. My hope is that the committee will take my comments into consideration and amend H.R. 1979 to preserve the opportunity for swordfish fishermen to fish with the current sustainably managed gear until an alternative gear that works economically is available. The West Coast swordfish drift net fishery is strictly regulated by the National Marine Fisheries Service and in coordination with the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. The fishery is currently in full compliance with the MSA, the MMPA, and the ESA. The Pacific Offshore Crustacean Truck Take Reduction Team was created in 1996. In 1997, they implemented measures that resulted in an immediate 50% reduction in marine mammal interaction, and we've continued to work to improve these results. In 2018, the drift net fishery was reclassified by NOAA as a Category 2 fishery under the MMPA. This means there's only an occasional incidental mortality and serious injury of marine mammals, and is further scientific proof is how well we've been doing to reduce all the interactions of marine mammals. The United States eats more swordfish than any other country. Shutting down this fishery only served to increase the importation of swordfish from harvesting nations whose environmental standards are far below those of the domestic fishery. It is likely that eradicating our highly regulated fishery will result in a net conservation loss as fishing efforts shifts to harvesting nations with less concern over impacts to marine mammals and other species of concern. H.R. 1979 references alternative gear with minimal incidental catch on living marine resources. It's pretty clear this bill refers to deep-set buoy gear. This gear type is being evaluated under EFP authorization by National Marine Fisheries, and a number of DGN boats have tried it. Unfortunately, the limiting amount of attempts to date have shown that deep-set buoy gear catches less swordfish than drift net fishery. Fewer swordfish means lower revenues for the boats, and the current testing rates of deep-set buoy gear is not economically viable alternative for our fleet. Deep-set buoy gear was never designed as a standalone fishery method. It was designed to supplement the harpoon fishery. I would request the chairman include a copy of the letter from the fishermen currently trying to make deep-set buoy gear work and highlighting how this gear is still a work in progress. I want to make it very clear that the impacts of H.R. 1979 on the drift net fleet will shut it down. Alternative gear is not ready to support economically viable fishing for swordfish off the West Coast. We respectfully ask that the committee to support a reasonable amendment to H.R. 1979 that will allow a sustainable managed fishery to continue to support hardworking families, businesses, and take the time to ensure that alternative gear is proven effective and economically viable before mandating its use. And I want to actually, I'm not a public speaker. I'd like to apologize for having to read this statement, but 5 minutes for defending 40 years of my livelihood is not a long time. So.
But you did bring it right in on time, Mr. Burke, so thank you. And the committee now recognizes Ms. Newkirk for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Huffman and members of the subcommittee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify on H.R. 2189, the Digital Coast Act. My name is Sarah Newkirk, and I'm the Director of Disaster Resilience for the Nature Conservancy in California. The Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization dedicated to conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. Guided by science, we create innovative, on-the-ground solutions to the world's toughest challenges so that nature and people can thrive together. Our Coastal Resilience Program works to illuminate nature's role in reducing coastal flood risk through science, planning, and technology, and in its 10 years has reached more than 100 communities around the world. The Nature Conservancy is a founding member and strong supporter of the Digital Coast Partnership. Under the leadership of NOAA, the partnership works to provide the tools, data, and training that local governments, organizations, and others need to protect themselves from coastal risks like storm, flooding, and inundation. We at the Nature Conservancy use this same information ourselves to make conservation investments in coastal land as part of our commitment to preserving biodiversity, open space, and risk reduction for coastal communities. In my 14 years with the Nature Conservancy, I've worked on both coasts in New York and California to support communities planning for and recovering from coastal disasters. In 2007, my colleagues and I created and launched the first coastal resilience tool, which delivered coastal geospatial data to communities on Long Island. Our hope was that these communities would use this information not only to plan for the future of their built assets, but also to conserve their natural assets like wetlands because of nature's power to dampen waves and absorb floodwaters. NOAA was our first partner in that effort, and they helped us access digital elevation data, make projections of economic losses from flooding, and project flood inundation scenarios over digital elevation maps so that we could then go out and train communities to use this information to plan for their own risks. In late October 2012, about a year after I relocated to California, a New York colleague sent me an email that had only one line. It said, "What you said would happen, happened." New York had been struck by Hurricane Sandy, a storm whose devastation impacted everyone and everything in New York. Wall Street suspended trading, the UN shut its doors, and the New York subway and commuter rail services stopped running. I was heartened to learn that the evacuations and recovery efforts were made easier by the maps we developed in partnership with NOAA. And on top of that, our science showed that investments in wetland protection before Sandy saved $625 million in property damage during the disaster. In 2012, my California colleagues and I started a project called Coastal Resilience Ventura. Ventura County, California is a beautiful place with a little of everything: citrus and almond orchards, and charming commercial districts side by side with beautiful open space and really important military infrastructure. But Ventura County has a lot on the line at risk of coastal flooding, implicating many diverse stakeholders. But by this point, the Digital Coast Partnership had released a more or less comprehensive map of coastal flood risk on the West Coast, and we used these maps to convene the stakeholders and say to them, "This is your community. This is your community with 5 feet of flooding. How does that make you feel, and what are you worried about?" The Nature Conservancy is still working with a subset of these stakeholders, including the U.S. Navy, to refine their hazard mitigation plans and assess and make investments in natural infrastructure. The Digital Coast is nationwide in scope, and my written testimony contains stories of applications from Alaska, Maryland, and Puerto Rico, as well as California. The Digital Coast represents the federal government at its best, providing essential information that helps communities help themselves by setting priorities for building infrastructure, investing in parks and open space, and keeping people in neighborhoods safe. These are some of the most important functions of government, but unfortunately, some local governments lack the resources and capacity to bring the best science to bear. The Digital Coast brings these resources to the table, supporting management, land use, and emergency response decisions with a strong foundation in science and technology. Study after study has shown that investment in preparedness pays for itself many times over, and recognizing this Congress recently passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which sets aside 6% of disaster expenses to fund preparedness. But all the funding in the world won't help if communities don't have the data and information they need to make smart preparedness decisions, and the Digital Coast fills that gap. Over 15 years, NOAA predicts a 411% return on investment from the Digital Coast Partnership. The strong bipartisan support for this measure is an illustration of its broad appeal and value to the nation's communities. Thank you for the opportunity to express the Nature Conservancy's support for this measure, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Newkirk. The chair now recognizes Dr. Penny for 5 minutes.
Gods may we. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on legislation to reauthorize the Sea Grant Program. My name is Zach Penny, and I'm the Science Department Manager for the Columbia Intertribal Fish Commission, which I'll refer to as CRITFIC for the rest of my testimony. I'd like to use my time today to discuss the work of CRITFIC and the ways in which the mission of our tribes has benefited from this very important program. CRITFIC was founded in 1977 by the four Columbia River Treaty Tribes, which are the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation, and the Nez Perce Tribe, of which I'm a member. CRITFIC provides coordination and technical assistance to the tribes to ensure that treaty fishing issues are resolved in a way that guarantees the viability of tribal fisheries into perpetuity. Our ancestral homeland covers nearly 1/3 of the Columbia River Basin, with over half of that area that is still accessible to anadromous fish like salmon, steelhead, and Pacific lamprey. As co-managers, CRITFIC and the tribes are globally recognized leaders in fisheries restoration and management. We're integral to the region's efforts to halt the decline of anadromous fish. Columbia River fish form the core of high-value fisheries from the interior west to small communities in Idaho that depend on sport fishing dollars, all the way to southeast Alaska, where the southeast troll fishery combined with, is valued at about hundreds of millions of dollars. Sea Grant's mission is to enhance the use and conservation of coastal resources to create a robust and sustainable economy and environment. Sea Grant links goal-directed research and the delivery of that knowledge, helping to solve societally relevant problems. Sea Grant's research agenda is informed by stakeholder input and is directed towards solving local, regional, and national coastal and marine issues. The education of the next generation in diverse fields is intimately integrated into both Sea Grant's research and extension activities. Sea Grant's connection to coastal habitats and the human communities that depend on them is well aligned with the mission of CRITFIC. Our tribal fisheries are largely focused on anadromous species that spend more than half of their lives in the Pacific Ocean. Sea Grant's investments directly support the fish and the fisheries that are vital to tribal ceremony, subsistence, our economy, as well as our identity. On a personal level, the Sea Grant program plays a vital role in facilitating professional development opportunities in ocean and coastal policy making. An example of this opportunity came for me in the form of the John Knaus Fellowship. Now, my path to the fellowship is a little unusual compared to some fellows. I finished my PhD at the University of Idaho in 2013, so obviously Idaho does not have an ocean or a Great Lakes along its border, but Oregon Sea Grant was nice enough to allow me to apply through their program. But as a tribal member who's focused work, both on my dissertation and what I do currently, on anadromous fish that are, in many cases are ESA-listed populations, coexisting within the federal Columbia River hydro system, it became pretty evident to me at the time that federal policies affected much of what I was studying and why I was studying it. Furthermore, federal policies profoundly affect me as a Nez Perce tribal member of a federally recognized tribe. So the Knaus Fellowship was the right type of opportunity at the right time to help facilitate my understanding of congressional policy making. So not only did I get the opportunity to assist members of Congress in their public policy responsibilities, but I also gained an understanding of the balance that members and their staffs must keep with regard to their constituents, their districts, and the climate of the nation. For the past 3 years, the administration has proposed to terminate the Sea Grant program along with the Sea Grant STEM education activities and the Knaus Fellowship program. Thankfully, so far, Congress has rejected these proposals. The administration is again calling for the termination of Sea Grant in FY20. I believe Congress should instead strengthen this program because of the impact and the return investment Sea Grant delivers to coastal communities and the economies. In FY17, the Sea Grant program helped generate an estimated $579 million in economic impacts. It created or supported over 12,500 jobs, assisted 462 communities to improve their resilience to things like climate change, helped nearly 17,700 fishers adopt safe and sustainable fishing practices. It helped restore an estimated 700,000 acres of coastal ecosystems, worked with about 1,300 industry, private sector, local, state, and regional partners, and supported the education and training of over 1,800 undergraduate and graduate students. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the invitation to appear before this subcommittee and to offer my strong endorsement for H.R. 2405. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Penny. The chair now recognizes Mr. Steve Ellis for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Huffman, Congressman Young, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I am Steve Ellis, Executive Vice President of Taxpayers for Common Sense, a national nonpartisan budget watchdog. Many areas of government have continued operations under expired authorizations or without adequate congressional oversight. TCS has criticized Congress under leadership of both parties for not conducting adequate oversight and holding the executive branch sufficiently accountable. So in that light, taking the steps to reauthorize the Noaa Officer Corps is heartening, and the subcommittee is to be congratulated. That said, TCS is not taking a position on H.R. 2406 at this time. Instead, I will lay out some concerns with the legislation as well as opportunities for oversight, investigation, and reform. We believe taxpayers will be better served if the subcommittee conducts greater oversight over the Noaa Corps and its function prior to adopting this legislation. Among other things, H.R. 2406 would dramatically increase the number of authorized Noaa Corps commissioned officers to 500, increase the number of flag officers, enable the Secretary of Commerce to determine the ratio of officers in each grade, and extend a series of protections and benefits currently only available to members of the armed forces. Congress set the authorized limit of the Noaa Corps at 321. 500 would be a 55% increase over the current cap. It is unclear why such a large increase in authorized officers is needed. NOAA is undergoing a fleet modernization recapitalization plan. Typically, more modern vessels require fewer crew, not more. In addition, NOAA intends to pursue fewer different types of vessels, which reduces operational and maintenance training requirements. The increase in benefits to Noaa Corps officers is also curious. These benefits are provided to the military services, including enlisted personnel, of which there are none in the Noaa Corps, to attract and retain a qualified all-volunteer military that is willing and capable of being in harm's way. This is not meant to disparage the Noaa Corps' laudable mission, but to point out that provision of benefits to Noaa Corps officers simply because they also wear a uniform doesn't necessarily make sense. There are several other areas Congress should explore in oversight regarding the Noaa Corps. The use of contract vessels. NOAA currently uses contract vessels for some of their work. These could either be entirely contracted or contract vessel with and a crew with a NOAA scientific team on board for data collection. This can be a cost-effective way to carry out the NOAA mission with less expense than full vessel recapitalization, recognizing that some NOAA vessel capacity must be retained to respond quickly to emergencies such as post-disaster surveys for navigational safety. Not complete prioritization, as Representative Case applied earlier today. Relatedly, Congress has directed NOAA to acquire hydrographic data from the private sector, quote, to the greatest extent practical and cost-effective. But the Government Accountability Office found that in cost competitions, NOAA failed to include some of the capital costs of their hydrographic survey program. On the other side of the ledger, NOAA failed to include contract administration costs for private sector contractors. The subcommittee should seek out cost and performance differences between contract and NOAA vessels and adjust recapitalization accordingly. Actual personnel need. As mentioned, H.R. 2406 sets the NOAA Corps officer cap at 500. As recently as 2002, Congress envisioned 321 with a potential for 379 by 2009. What is the actual number of officers needed? My experience is that the number of officers will expand to meet the cap provided. Further use of civilian federal employees, contractors, and unmanned survey vessels should be considered. It is notable that while Coast Guard and naval vessels have enlisted crewmen, NOAA vessels rely on mates and able-bodied seamen and other personnel for crew and engineering billets. Indeed, some NOAA ships have a civilian commanding officer or master. Vessel usage. The FY 2020 budget justification indicates that NOAA intends to achieve 2,525 days at sea with its 15 operational vessels this year. That works out to just under 178 days at sea per vessel. In the ship recapitalization plan, NOAA indicates that each vessel requires 130 days per year for maintenance, crew rest, and research staging. That leaves a gap of 65 days unaccounted for. Reevaluation of the Noaa Corps. The Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard have military compensation models in order to recruit and maintain an all-volunteer force to fight for and defend our nation. The vast majority of ships plying the world's oceans and waterways are operated by civilian crews. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operates ships that are entirely civilian crewed. The majority of crew on the NOAA ships are civilians. Before enacting a large expansion of the authorized NOAA Officer Uniform Corps, the subcommittee should examine this issue and conclude whether a uniform NOAA Corps continues to make sense. NOAA's mission includes important survey, mapping, research, and scientific activities that are essential for the public, commerce, and the government. As a deck watch officer on a Coast Guard buoy tender, I benefited from their work and contributed to it by helping launch NOAA data buoys. But the question is how to best meet these needs in the most cost-effective manner. TCS urges the subcommittee to consider the significant issues I've raised as part of reauthorizing the NOAA Commissioned Officer Corps. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and as promised, Mr. Shedd, I want to come back to you. You wanted to respond to the testimony of the NOAA Rear Admiral regarding drift gillnet fisheries.
Thank you. What I was referring to was the deep set buoy gear and the fact that it will provide not only a better quality fish, but a lot more of them and a lot, so increase in jobs and income. The reason for that is National Marine Fisheries Service has already done a study, and they said if you had just 50 deep set buoy gear boats in operation, they would produce 250 metric tons of swordfish a year. That is twice the amount that is caught in the average over the last couple of years by the entire drift gill net fleet. And you might wonder, well, geez, will there be 50 people that actually want to do that and be able to do it? There already are 50 permits that have been issued. Guys are chomping at the bit. There's many more that want to participate. So yes, the fishermen will be there. And the reason that they're there, and it was said earlier with relative to this deep set buoy gear that's not ready for prime time. It is absolutely ready for prime time because since 2011, folks have been working on developing the gear, figured out how to make it work. Scientists from Pier figured that out. Then in 2014, they invited commercial fishermen, 6 commercial fishermen, several of them former gill net fishermen, to use the gear. What they found was that 80% of the catch is swordfish. They catch more than 1.75 fish a day, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the fish are worth over $1,000 a piece when used deep set buoy gear because of the high value of the fish. It's very close to what's caught on average by drift gill nets. And when you add harpoon to it, they catch a little less than a half fish a day. You catch just under the same amount of fish, but you receive way more money than what you receive from from drift gill nets.
Mr. Shedd, just to follow up on your testimony, did I hear you correctly that the bycatch rate for drift gill nets is 64%?
That's correct. And they continue to claim that, well, first off, they say that the bycatch is down, and absolutely unequivocally for sure, bycatch is way down from what it used to be. It's still 64%, but it's way less than what it used to be. There's 2 key issues
Just so we all understand what that means. That means 64% of the things caught in the drift gill net are not the fish that are being targeted.
That's
It's
correct.
other stuff.
Then it's either released, it's not used. It's thrown back alive or it's thrown back dead.
What do you say to Mr. Burke's testimony that this will put him out of business and that we are unfairly targeting a sustainable fishery, the drift gill net fishery?
Well, first off, it's not a sustainable fishery. If you go back to 1985, there was 220-some boats fishing with drift gill nets. Today, there is 17. The reason that it shrunk so much is it's not sustainable. For years, we've been trying to figure out how to make this gear safer, and haven't been able to do it. So what we have to do is we have to close off areas like for leatherback turtles. 42,000 miles of area have been closed because during part of the season because concern for gill nets.
If you use deep set buoys, would some of those areas be fishable again?
No, not some of them, all of them, which
Okay.
is part of the reason why you'll see an increase in commercial fishermen and
Thank you.
commercial jobs.
Mr. Burke, let me come back to you, and I just want to ask you one question. It sure seems to me, with so many states, so many countries around the world banning this particular method of fishing, all arrows are pointing to the fact that drift gill nets are not long for this world. Have you got a backup plan? Because I certainly would be thinking about that if I were in your shoes. Nobody wants to end your livelihood here, but we're being told there are other ways to make your living, and I just wanted to ask you about that.
Thank you for the question, Chairman. First of all, within the other countries' EEZ, drift nets are still used. Chugi Sepulveda, who developed this buoy gear, just came back from Ecuador, and there's 2 fisheries there, harpoon fishery, small little one. The major fishery to catch swordfish and send it to the U.S. is gill net, 3.3 miles, he told me, and they catch a lot. So if you're asking me what would I do if I got put out of business?
Well,
This
I mean,
fishery?
you've heard the numbers. I mean, you're the last of the Mohicans here. There aren't too many people doing drift gill netting in U.S. waters. Surely you're looking at these alternative fishing methods and having some backup plans, I would hope.
Unfortunately, permits are limited in California. And if I lose this fishery, I can't just transition to something else. And unfortunately, buoy gear is predicated on a high price. They have to get $7 or $8 a pound, or that fishery is going under. The present people that are in it, the 5 or 6 guys, we're at the council level right now, making determination on how many permits and making a range of alternatives. They don't want more than 10 permits because they know it will not be a sustainable fishery if they don't get $7 or $8 a pound. And if you put too many people in this fishery, it will collapse.
I'm past my time. I want to recognize Ranking Member Young for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Molly, your data that you collect, is it used in our state, especially in the coastal waters? Is it tie in with the mapping program at all?
With the what program? I'm sorry.
No, I mean, your data that you collect, is it applied to the coastal areas of Alaska?
Yes.
For navigation, everything else?
Yes, we work really closely with all of our navigation partners. We have the Alaska Water Level Watch, so we're working with them trying to improve hydrographic surveys, bathymetric surveys. They need tide information to connect the bathymetry with the coastline. As you know, we've got a big ocean. It's not charted very well, so we're working, how do you get some crowdsourced types of bathymetry? How do you work with the tug and barge companies that, everything changes every year at the mouths of the Yukon and Kuskokwim, and they really need that kind of information.
My answer, Molly, is that we are going to increase sea traffic, and we need to be mapped or not mapped correctly yet. We've had a couple incidents. Mr. Burke, I'm going to give you the rest of my time. I'd like to comment on this thing. I feel for you. You've been in this business 54 years. You get 5 minutes. That's really not correct. And it's easier for someone else to say you can do something else. How does this work? We have different figures, different numbers. We have figures and numbers from Noah. You're different than the gentleman next to you. And I mean, how can I defend you if I wish to defend you?
Well, thank you for that question, but in reality, some of the stuff that Mr. Shedd tells you, we have different opinions and different statistics. I have, for the last 4 years, I looked up what we catch under the observer coverage, and what our bycatch is it ranged from, this is 14-15 season to 17-18 season. Our bycatch was 33% 1 year, 52 1 year, 13% 1 year, and 25% 1 year. And one thing you got to remember is that half of that bycatch, half of it, over half, is a fish called mola mola, which is not killed at all. 99% of it is returned alive. So if you cut all that bycatch in half, we're at 10-15% bycatch. One thing Mr. Shedd includes, I'm afraid, is fish like bluefin tuna, luvar, opa. Some of those, we don't throw those back, but somebody says it's not a target species, it's maybe, and then they call it a bycatch. One of the biggest mistakes we ever made when we transitioned from shark to swordfish, we called it a swordfish fishery. We should have said it was a large mesh fishery, because in today's world, the extra stuff we catch, which provides some of the best eating fish in the world, opa and luvar. Luvar is probably the best eating fish there is. We get as much money, if not more, in some of those fisheries than swordfish. And a lot of times you'll make more money on that fishery than you will in swordfish. And the other part of it is, too, that the drift net fishery produces like 3 to 4 times as much as the buoy gear guys. And right now you only have a small percentage of buoy gear guys doing it. The guys who originally started it had a couple good years. But last year, I got 6 guys that have EFPs and buoy gear from Santa Barbara. One guy over the course of the season had 12 fish. The other 5 guys had 0 to 2. They had to pay for the gear. The original guys in the buoy gear came up and their gear was bought for by Pew. If you would go into this business to catch as little as they did and have to put $15,000 in it, in your own pocket, I don't think you're going to get a lot of guys into it. And I know it will fail if they get too many. As soon as imports come in, and last year the price went to $5, all the buoy gear guys quit. And you got to remember another thing. We have some fishermen in our fishery that in one trip, 10 days, catch as much as all the other highline guys caught and the other guys caught in 6 months. One trip in swordfish, some of the guys catch 100 swordfish. That's what the highliners did in the buoy gear fishery. It's apples and oranges. There's no comparison.
I thank you, and I'm going to get this from you in writing. And Mr. Chairman, I do not appreciate this battle goes on in Alaska, it goes on the West Coast, goes on the Gulf. It's the sport fishermen casting the commercial fishermen in a bad light. This is about who gets the fish, and that's not fair. There should be sit down and figure out how we can work together and get the job done. It'd be good for both sides of the aisle, and I'm very strong about that. The sport fishermen, by the way, are about as selfish as I've ever seen. And I say that to the people in the state of Alaska. They want every fish for themselves, not in the commercial fishery. They don't want anybody to catch any salmon other than themselves. They want to catch the first fish for first cast.
Well, that's certainly what I want when I come to Alaska. With the ranking member's indulgence, I'd like to ask unanimous consent for Representative Dingle to sit at the dais and participate in the hearing.
I have done.
Without objection. Mr. Lowenthal, you're recognized for 5 minutes. All right.
Well, I reserve judgment until later. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I represent the city of Long Beach, which is a coastal community in California. We recently had the city called a community meeting for the homeowners that live along the coast in some of the most expensive homes in California, if not in the nation. The homeowners were generally, the message that was told to the homeowners was generally, you'd better start thinking about an exit strategy. What that meant was that while there may be still things, and there are things that we can deal with still about climate change, significant damage has already occurred and will continue to occur in the future. So while flooding in the past has been quite infrequent in these areas along the coast, we are anticipating flooding on a regular basis in the future. And it was estimated at the community meeting, which I think shocked the community members, that the coast will rise up to 11 inches by 2030, and by 2050 it could be up to 2 feet, and anywhere from 36 to 66 inches by the end of the century. That was a shock to these homeowners. So, Ms. Newkirk, I have a question. There's clearly going to be a need for data in coastal communities like my community, with diverse sets of challenges that's going to be needed throughout the country. What is happening in Long Beach is not unique just to Long Beach. Can you tell me how communities such as Long Beach can use the digital coast to meaningfully apply data to both prepare and to begin to mitigate the challenges that climate change presents and will present even more so in the future? Regardless of even if we stop right now, we make dramatic changes.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And conversations in communities just like Long Beach around the country are happening and will continue to happen, as land use is essentially a local function, and every community's decisions about their risk tolerance and about how they will adapt to changing sea conditions and changing coastal conditions will be a local decision. There's no question, though, that the more data they have at their disposal and the more information and training they have at their disposal, the more informed those decisions will be. And NOAA's Digital Coast Project has traditionally provided the Digital Coast has effectively equalized various communities' informational status as it regards to planning for coastal change, and making the wealthy communities equivalent to the less well-endowed communities able to make similarly informed management decisions. With regard to the question of managed retreat that it seems like you're raising from your own community conversation in Long Beach, those conversations are happening around California as well. And almost every community's formula for dealing with coastal risk is going to be a combination of those kinds of strategies along with more sort of engineered strategies like seawalls. And this kind of information really puts the communities in the best position to make those kinds of decisions. I'll add also that public-private partnerships like the Digital Coast really leverages the federal taxpayers' dollar with regard to investment in that information.
Thank you, and I have another brief question. Can you think of any instances where the outcomes of storms or flooding events might have been different, what had happened, if a tool like the Digital Coast had been fully utilized? Can you think of anywhere we might have had different outcomes?
I think that almost, I mean, it's very difficult to speculate on the storm that could have happened or the disaster that could have occurred. But there's no question that investments in information that allow for informed planning is a good use of money. The Nature Conservancy's own science after Hurricane Sandy showing that investments in wetland restoration and protection yielded benefits of $625 million in property, saved property damages after the storm is an example of that. And I think that science all over the country is showing similar results.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Dingell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing, and it's always a pleasure to be in the presence of Dean Young, so it's great to be here. And I thank you, most importantly, for, he can't help himself. Given the critical role that the Great Lakes ecosystem plays in our nation's overall environmental health, I'm really happy that the committee included the Great Lakes Fishery Research Reauthorization Act of 2019 in today's hearing, because it really does matter. The legislation will strengthen our understanding of Great Lakes fisheries and provide additional resources for research into the Great Lakes Basin's fishery and biology. So I'm going to direct and thank you to all of the panel. Your contributions are really important, but I am going to direct these to Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, how do the Great Lakes compare to other regions of the country in terms of authority and resources to implement sustainable fishery management practices based on science? In other words, has the Great Lakes been left behind?
Yeah, they absolutely have, and I certainly appreciate the question. In 1970, President Nixon passed the act that enabled National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration to manage fisheries on the coasts. And the Great Lakes have been left under the radar in that instance, whereas NOAA does not have a responsibility to manage fisheries or conduct research in the Great Lakes region. That leaves this inherently federal responsibility in the hands of either the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Geological Survey. Up until about the mid-1990s, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service undertook this responsibility with neither authorization nor funding. When Biological Resources Division was switched over to USGS, that responsibility has thus been converted to United States Geological Survey. They have the responsibility, they own it, they're conducting it, but their funding is limited because it's not an inherent responsibility, nor is it authorized fully by the federal government. And so this act will allow that to happen.
So can you quickly tell us what technologies are out there but aren't being used in application for the Great Lakes?
Absolutely. Just like we have surveillance technology that is improving dramatically, let's say for the defense of the United States, those technologies are also improving for research on fisheries. And this will enable devices like autonomous data collection to occur in the Great Lakes. It will allow for biological observer networks to be formed. It will allow for the appropriate technology to come into the Great Lakes to help to manage our fisheries in a sustainable manner.
So most people don't understand this, but the Great Lakes, unlike the coastal areas, go dark in the winter, which means for several months of the year we've got ice cover and severe conditions, which means that fishery managers require technology when the lakes inaccessible. Most people don't realize that about us. Dr. Moore, how could the Great Lakes Fishery Research Reauthorization Act address that need?
Well, this act will provide the authorization for the United States Geological Survey to conduct this necessary fisheries research to enable sustainable fisheries, but it also should dedicate funding to allow for these improvements in technology such that data can be collected during the times of the year when the lakes are entirely inaccessible due to ice cover. And the way I think about this from a monetary perspective is you guys have authorized $800 billion to defend our country from invaders. This is a fraction of that amount to defend our natural resources and our environment so that they're sustainable, so that people can subsist off of them, in particular the tribe for whom I work, which is the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa.
I want to thank you. I'm going to yield back, but I will make the point that the Great Lakes are 20% of the world's fresh water, and it's important to protect the Great Lakes ecosystem, and I hope we will give serious consideration to this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go Great Lakes. All right.
Oh, go Great Lakes. I thought you said no Great Lakes.
No. We love the Great Lakes. Mr. Young had to leave, which is really unfortunate because I was this close to a breakthrough on anthropogenic climate change. We were having a little conversation here. But with that, I understand Mr. Graves will arrive shortly and take over ranking member duties. We'll recognize Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Huffman, and thank you to our witnesses for your written testimony and for participating in the hearing today. I represent coastal Southern California, so I care very much about our Pacific Ocean, and we've got the Scripps Institute of Oceanography that's done a ton of work. So I wanted to ask some questions regarding your work, some of what I read, and a topic that's on the minds of many of us in Washington right now, which is infrastructure. And specifically green infrastructure, which you hear a lot about. I wanted to ask Ms. Newkirk, members on both sides of the aisle have expressed interest in addressing our nation's aging infrastructure, and yet not much has gotten done, at least not yet. I hold out hope. In your testimony, you mentioned opportunities for green infrastructure development. And I wanted to ask, what are some specific examples of green infrastructure that we in Congress can support to protect coastal communities such as my own?
The term green infrastructure or natural infrastructure has actually has a definition in California law, but it doesn't include, it includes things like cobble berms and restored wetlands, marshes, and dune systems. But it should include open space as well. And when the Nature Conservancy speaks about green infrastructure or natural infrastructure, it also includes open space areas. So when we conserve wetlands along the coast, we're making investments in natural infrastructure because of those ecosystems' power to dampen waves and reduce storm surge.
Thank you. Wanted to also ask about the Integrated Ocean Observing System. And Ms. McCammon, I read that IOS, did I get that right, is important for both the ocean economy and the ocean environment. Could you provide some examples how it benefits the ocean economy and the ocean environment?
Well, I think the more ocean information you have, the better you can make decisions. And those decisions can be protecting resources, managing fisheries, managing marine mammals, or they could be used by a shipping company to better transit an area. It could be used by an offshore oil and gas or wind farm to better site things like that. So it really is a win-win for both.
Very good. And on a related note, we have the Southern California Coastal Ocean Observing System. I'm curious if you could speak to the interaction between IOS and a regional system like we've got in Southern California.
Well, the national program collects or federates basically all of the 18 federal agencies and tries to get them working together. What the regional systems like SCOOS, the Southern California one, does, and what the Alaska one does, is really focus on the local and regional stakeholders. And what are those particular issues? We have all these large national issues, but they're different in every region of the country. And so the Southern California one really focuses on the stakeholders for the Long Beach Harbor. How do you get ships safely into Long Beach Harbor? They focus a lot on harmful algal blooms. They focus a lot on waves. They really do a lot of information and data for beaches so that you have safe beaches that with good water quality and knowledge about riptides and things like that. So that's the key partnership between the national program and the regional programs.
Very good. I appreciate all the good work that you're doing, and I'll yield back to my friend, the chairman. Thank you very much, Congressman Levin, and I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. Members may have some additional questions. Oh,
I feel like I'm here.
the ranking member has arrived. You're right. I should give you the opportunity for, would you like to use 5 minutes in any way you see fit?
I would. That would be great.
All right, great.
Gosh,
Sorry about that.
so tired of
I thought
getting
you were just
railroaded
doing
by
the
you guys. I mean, it's-
ministerial function of,
look, I know you pretend like we're
keeping
not
an
here,
eye
but
on
I didn't
us.
think you'd actually do it publicly. I mean, geez. Hey, thank you all very much for being here today. One of the bills that's on the agenda today, H.R. 1979, to improve the management of drift net by Congressman Liu. I'm from South Louisiana, where we have, actually, I'll ask you a question, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, good. Here we
The state with the top fishing landings in the continental United
what
States.
state has the top fishing landings? I'm just curious.
Yeah, and so that would be Louisiana. That was a good question. As a matter of fact, top landings of things like shrimp and crabs and oysters and a lot of other species that are very important to our health and our tables around the country. One of the bills, though, again, H.R. 1979, it's a gill net ban, and I really do appreciate the fact that this bill is being proposed by a Californian, and I love that Californians are beginning to catch up with Louisiana, because we did this back in 1995. And I think if y'all continue to follow our lead, that state has so much potential. But Mr. Shedd, let me ask you a question. Do you think that California should follow Louisiana's lead in banning gill nets out in the Pacific?
They already have.
I'll be a Cajun with you.
Fantastic.
Are you going to point out to him that California actually already did this?
As I recall, Mr. Chairman, I think y'all have 17 fishers that continue to use gill nets.
Federal water.
That's right. We ban them in federal waters as well. So once again, I appreciate California catching up. And look, I mean, we did this in '95. So I mean, that's great that y'all are only about 24 years behind us. I mean, y'all are doing much better. I'm proud of you. But this is really important because a lot of the bycatch, and this is an issue that I think we do share, a lot of the bycatch that results from that type of blunt approach in fishing is adverse to, I think, what both of our goals are, better management of our fisheries. We did pass legislation out of the committee last year, and I know you viewed it as being imperfect, although I know you were supportive of a lot of the provisions in there, and we were continuing to work on that. But we also enacted the Modern Fish Act, which does try and attempt a better balance. It does between rec and commercial fisheries. It does bring a better and additional science to the table to inform our management practices. And I think that's very important, and glad that we were able to make that progress. I also want to thank Congressman Soto for bringing up H.R. 417, which is the invasive lionfish legislation that predatory species is having an impact on a lot of the kind of ecological balance of the fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico, and I appreciate him bringing that legislation up as well. But most importantly, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking forward to working with you. There are a lot of fish bills here. As we said, we do need to continue moving forward to try and reauthorize Magnuson-Stevens and hopefully add some of the provisions from Modern Fish back to that bill that were removed by the United States Senate. I appreciate all of y'all being here today and looking forward to continuing to engage you, including some questions for the record we will be submitting to a few of you. But we've got to do a better job bringing in better science. I think doing a better job balancing our recreational and commercial fisheries, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, where there is such an extraordinary demand on both the recreational and commercial sides. And I think it's not working out well for either side, but especially for the millions of Americans that like to enjoy recreational fishing out in the Gulf that have been, in many cases, prevented from doing so.
Congressman, can I answer the question you asked earlier? And that is, do I think gill net should be banned? And yes, absolutely, for two main reasons. There's really two issues here. One is this whole issue of bycatch. And I just encourage the committee to look at the record, look at the facts, We can sit and argue about bycatch and what's, you can cherry pick a year. The reality is that bycatch has been, is, and will continue to be a huge problem with gill nets in perpetuity. It's a little bit like the only way to totally manage it and where it's been successful is where the gear has come out. The gear has come out because the fishermen have dropped from over 200 to 17. So you've got, it's true, there's less bycatch, but it's because there's less nets in the water. As an analogy, if you were trying to fish bass in a pond with dynamite, it wouldn't matter how you tried to manage the dynamite, you're going to have bycatch regardless of what you do. So removing the nets is the only way to prevent the bycatch.
And I think that is a recognized method in Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken.
The second point I want to make here in the last 20 seconds.
What?
The second point I want to make in the last 15 seconds is this whole issue of deep set buoy gear. There is a very extensive report that chronicles the last 7 years, 8 years of development of this method. It works. It catches the fish that you want. Commercial fishermen are clamoring for the opportunity to take advantage of the permits. This is going to be the future of sword fishery in California, is deep set buoy gear.
And along those lines, Mr. Chairman, I do think it's important for these 17 fishers that are continuing to use that technology. Let's make sure that we are being sensitive to their history and making sure that we are working on transition plans to ensure that they can continue participating in fishing activities, but perhaps under newer technologies now that California is becoming more sensitive to the environment like we are in Louisiana.
Well said. So folks who are new to the subcommittee may not realize that Mr. Graves actually loves California. He just...
My wife lived there.
He has a strange way of showing it, but we appreciate that and appreciate the witnesses and questions from the members. There may be some additional questions that members would ask you to respond to in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee will have to submit those questions within 3 business days, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
All right. We prevented, how you doing? We prevented all.